Do you even understand English, or just menus? The words landed sharp and careless, cutting through the low hum of jazz and the soft clink of crystal in Delmonico Prime, one of Manhattan's most exclusive steakhouses where deals worth hundreds of millions were sealed over dry-aged ribeye and $300 bottles of Napa Valley Cabernet, and yet no one at table 12 laughed too loudly, not because it was funny, but because the man who said it never needed approval. Ethan Caldwell didn't repeat himself, didn't look up, didn't need to. His knife glided through the steak like he owned the moment, like he owned the room, like he owned her. Naomi Brooks stood beside him, posture straight, expression calm, the kind of calm that didn't come from comfort but from practice, years of learning how to exist in spaces where people looked past you until they needed something, her hand steady, her eyes quiet but alert, because while Ethan Caldwell spoke in numbers and dominance, she listened in patterns and details. Every word, every tone, every careless slip that people like him believed disappeared into the background. Medium rare, he added, almost as an afterthought, and trying not to mess it up this time. A faint smirk touched the corner of his mouth, not directed at her but through her, like she was part of the furniture, something useful but never important. The men across from him chuckled politely, their suits crisp, their watches gleaming, their eyes calculating, because tonight wasn't just dinner, it was negotiation, a deal. Hovering somewhere north of $250 million, whispered in fragments between bites and sips, offshore accounts, silent partners, timing windows, phrases that floated just above the surface of legality, but never quite sank into it. Not in a place like this, not with people like them. Naomi nodded once, no reaction, no resistance, just acknowledgement, and turned toward the kitchen, her step smooth, controlled. But something had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of shift you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, and no one ever looked at her long enough to see it. Minutes later she returned, the plate perfectly arranged, the steak seared to precision, juices resting just right, a small detail in a room obsessed with control. She set it down in front of him with care, her fingers brushing the edge of the porcelain just long enough to leave something behind, something small, something folded, something no one else noticed, not the investors, not the assistant checking his phone, not even Ethan, at least not yet, because power had a way of blinding the people who held it. Naomi stepped back, silent again, invisible again, but this time it wasn't submission, it was timing. Ethan cut into the steak, took a bite, chewed slowly, confident, untouched. Then his eyes caught it, a sliver of white against the dark plate, out of place. He paused, just for a second, then reached for it, unfolding the note with casual irritation, expecting nothing, and that was the moment everything began to change. The paper felt heavier than it should have, just a small square folded once, but the moment Ethan Caldwell opened it, the noise of the restaurant seemed to pull back, not completely gone, but distant, like it no longer belonged to him. His eyes moved across the single line written in clean, precise handwriting, and for the first time that night, his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for the rhythm of his movements to break, enough for the man who had been speaking across from him to pause mid-sentence. Noticing the silence before understanding it, Ethan did not look up right away. He read it again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous, but they did not. They stayed exactly where they were, clear and unforgiving. His jaw tightened, just slightly, and his fingers pressed the edge of the note a little too hard, leaving a faint crease where there had not been one before. Across the table, Richard Hensley continued talking, smooth, confident, unaware, or pretending to be, his voice steady as he outlined projections, timelines, expansion routes into overseas markets, the kind of language that usually kept rooms like this under control. But Ethan was no longer listening to the words, he was watching the details, the way Richard's hand rested too casually near his jacket, the slight delay before he responded to certain questions, the almost invisible glance toward the man seated 2 chairs down, details that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to see them. And suddenly, Ethan did. He leaned back in his chair, slow, deliberate, buying himself time, his mind moving faster than his body ever would, calculating, measuring, testing the weight of what he had just read against everything he knew about the people sitting in front of him, because if the note was true, this was not a dinner, this was a setup, and if it was not true, then someone had just made a very dangerous move. Either way, the power in the room had shifted, quietly, but completely. Ethan reached for his glass, took a controlled sip. his eyes lifting just enough to scan the table again, this time with intention, this time with suspicion, and for a brief moment, his gaze flickered past Naomi Brooks, standing a few feet away, still, composed, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just placed a single sentence into his world and tilted it off balance. He looked at her longer than before, not fully, not openly, but enough to register something new. Not recognition, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when someone you dismissed suddenly becomes relevant, dangerously relevant. The conversation resumed around him, numbers continued, promises floated, but Ethan no longer moved with the same certainty, because now every word spoken at that table had a second meaning, every smile carried a question, and every second that passed without action felt like a risk he could not afford to ignore. The longer Ethan Caldwell sat there, the clearer it became that nothing about this dinner was normal anymore, not the tone, not the timing, not even the silence between sentences, because silence, he knew, was where the truth usually hid, and now it was everywhere, stretching across the table like something waiting to be noticed. He placed the note face down beside his plate, casual, controlled, but his mind did not slow, it sharpened, each second pulling him deeper into a quiet analysis he had spent years mastering in boardrooms and negotiations, except this time the stakes felt different, less visible, more personal. Richard Hensley kept talking, outlining profit margins with a confident rhythm, but Ethan noticed the shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, the way Richard's voice tightened just slightly when certain topics came up, the way his eyes flicked not toward Ethan, but toward the man seated to his left, a younger associate who had barely spoken all night yet seemed too attentive, too still, like someone waiting for a cue. Ethan followed that glance once, then again, and the pattern held, small, but consistent. He leaned forward, elbows lightly touching the edge of the table, as if re-engaging, as if nothing had changed, but now every word he spoke was deliberate, measured, designed not just to respond, but to provoke. "Walk me through that again," he said, voice calm, almost bored, but his eyes did not leave Richard's face. The room adjusted to him instantly, because that was what power did. It redirected attention without asking. Richard smiled, obliged, but there it was again, that half-second delay, that almost invisible recalculation before answering, and across the table, the younger associate shifted, just enough to confirm what Ethan had already begun to suspect. Something was off, not loud, not obvious, but precise, like a detail placed exactly where it should not be. Ethan reached for his phone. Not to use it, just to move it, to test reactions, and that was when he saw it, not directly, not clearly, but enough, a faint outline beneath the associate's jacket, a small, rigid shape where fabric should have fallen naturally, and suddenly the note was no longer a possibility. It was a warning, a precise one. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with clarity, the kind that comes when uncertainty collapses into understanding. He leaned back again, slower this time, his expression returning to something neutral, something controlled, but inside, the balance had shifted completely, because the man who walked into this restaurant expecting to dominate the table was now the one being watched, recorded, studied, and the only person who had seen it first, the only one who had chosen to act, was the woman he had dismissed without a second thought. Ethan's gaze moved again, this time directly to Naomi Brooks, and for the first time that night, he did not look through her, he looked at her, really at her, as if trying to understand how someone invisible had just become the most important presence in the room. Naomi Brooks did not move when he looked at her. She did not react, did not acknowledge, did not even blink differently, and that was what unsettled Ethan Caldwell the most, because everyone else in the room reacted to him, even when they tried not to. They adjusted their tone, their posture, their timing, but she did not. She remained exactly the same, composed, neutral, as if the shift in power he felt had not just happened, as if she had not just altered the entire trajectory of a deal worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Ethan turned his attention back to the table, but now he was playing a different game, not the one they thought they were negotiating, but one layered beneath it, one where information mattered more than appearances. He placed his fork down carefully, the soft clink against porcelain louder to him than it should have been, and leaned slightly forward, his voice steady, controlled. "Before we go any further, I want to revisit the structure of this agreement." The word sounded routine, expected, but the timing was not. It interrupted momentum, forced attention, and across from him, Richard Hensley paused again, just for a fraction too long, the smile returning a second too late. "Of course," Richard replied, smooth, but not as smooth as before, because now he was reacting, not leading. Ethan continued, asking questions that sounded simple on the surface but were designed to create pressure, to test consistency, to watch for cracks. Each answer he received was filtered through a new lens, every hesitation amplified, every glance noted, and the more he listened, the clearer it became that the confidence on the other side of the table was no longer as solid as it had been minutes ago. The associate shifted again, subtly adjusting his jacket, and that small movement confirmed everything, the presence of something hidden, something intentional, something that did not belong in a private negotiation like this. Ethan's expression did not change, but inside, the conclusion locked into place. This was not just business, this was exposure waiting to happen, and he had been seconds away from walking straight into it. He reached for his glass again, buying himself one more moment, and this time, when he set it down, he made a decision, a clean, decisive break from the script they expected him to follow. "I think we are done here," he said calmly, the words cutting through the conversation without force, but with finality. Confusion flickered across the table, brief, controlled, but undeniable. Richard leaned forward, attempting to recover. "I am not sure I follow," but Ethan was already standing, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the negotiation had ended on his terms, not theirs. And for the first time that night, the control he had lost began to return, not because of his power, but because he chose to act on the truth he had been given. And as he stepped back from the table, his eyes moved once more to Naomi Brooks, and this time, there was no dismissal in his gaze, only recognition. Because the most valuable move of the night had not come from a billionaire, it had come from the person no one thought was playing the game at all. The chair slid back into place with a soft, controlled sound, the kind that did not draw attention but carried weight for anyone paying close enough notice, and Ethan Caldwell did not rush as he stepped away from the table, because leaving too quickly would have meant losing control again, and control was the one thing he had just fought to regain. Behind him, the conversation tried to restart, voices lowering, questions forming, but none of them followed him immediately, not yet, because uncertainty had entered the room and no one wanted to be the first to expose it. Ethan walked past the polished bar, past the mirrored walls reflecting fragments of a night that no longer belonged to him, until he stopped just short of the service corridor where the noise softened and the light shifted from warm gold to a cooler, more honest white, and there she was, Naomi Brooks, already moving, already returning to the rhythm of her work as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just redirected the outcome of a deal worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. He spoke before he could reconsider, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "You wrote that note." It was not a question, not really, and Naomi paused, just slightly, enough to acknowledge the moment without surrendering to it. She turned to face him, calm, steady, the same composure she had held all night, but now it carried a different meaning. Not invisibility, but intention. "Yes," she said. Simply, no explanation, no apology, and that single word did something Ethan had not expected. It removed the mystery but left the weight, because now the question was not whether she had acted, but why. He studied her for a second longer, trying to place her, trying to understand how someone in her position had seen what he almost missed. "How did you know?" he asked, quieter now, more measured, and Naomi did not rush her answer. She glanced briefly toward the dining room, where the voices were beginning to rise again, tension slowly surfacing, then back to him. "People who think they are in control," she said, her tone even, "they stop paying attention to the small things." Ethan absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the truth of it, because she was right. He had been focused on the deal, the numbers, the outcome, and in doing so, he had ignored the details that did not fit, the same mistake he had built his reputation on never making, and yet tonight, he had come close, closer than he would ever admit out loud. "And you did not," he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi did not respond immediately. She adjusted the tray in her hands, grounding herself in the routine that had taught her to observe without being seen. "I have to notice," she replied finally. "It is how you stay ahead when no one expects you to be paying attention." There was no pride in her voice, no need to prove anything, just a quiet statement of fact, and that unsettled him more than any display of confidence could have, because it meant this was not a one-time act, not luck, not chance, but skill, developed in silence, sharpened in spaces where people like him never thought to look. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the night settling into something clearer, something more grounded. "You saved me from a very expensive mistake," he said, and this time, there was no arrogance left in the words, only acknowledgement, real and unfiltered. Naomi met his gaze, not with gratitude, not with expectation, but with something steadier, something rooted deeper than either of those. "I just gave you information," she said. "What you did with it was your choice." And in that moment, standing between the noise of power and the quiet of truth, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had not walked in knowing, that control did not always belong to the loudest voice in the room, and sometimes, the person who changed everything was the one no one had even bothered to see. Naomi Brooks turned before the moment could stretch any further, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that her role in the room had already been completed, and lingering would only shift the balance she had so carefully maintained. She moved back toward the dining floor, blending once again into the rhythm of service, the soft glide between tables, the measured pace, the invisible presence that allowed everything else to function without interruption. And for a second, Ethan Caldwell remained where he was, watching her go, not with confusion, but with a growing awareness that what had just happened could not be undone, not the deal, not the risk, and certainly not the way he now saw her. He stepped back into the dining room, and the energy had changed, not dramatically, not loud enough for anyone outside the table to notice, but different, tighter, more controlled. Richard Hensley was no longer speaking. Instead he sat back slightly, his expression composed but guarded, while the associate beside him adjusted his posture again, a fraction too late, a fraction too stiff, and Ethan recognized it immediately, the subtle shift from confidence to caution. He returned to the table without asking permission, without explaining, because he no longer needed to. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair but did not put it on, letting it rest over his arm as a signal that he was not fully staying, not fully leaving. He was deciding, and that uncertainty now belonged to them. "You should check your assumptions," Ethan said calmly, his voice even, but carrying a precision that cut through the remaining conversation. Richard forced a polite smile, attempting to regain control. "I assure you, everything has been thoroughly prepared," but Ethan's gaze did not shift. "Not this time." "I am sure you believe that," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, not aggressive, not loud, but certain, that made the table fall silent again, because certainty, when it changes sides, is impossible to ignore. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, and this time he did not pretend. He glanced down at the screen briefly, then back up, watching, waiting, and it happened, small but undeniable. The associate's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, not fully, not enough for anyone untrained to notice, but enough to confirm the presence of something hidden, something active, something that should never have been there in a private negotiation. Richard saw it too, just a flicker, just a moment, but long enough for the illusion to crack, and in that crack, the truth surfaced without needing to be spoken. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not accuse, did not escalate, because he did not need to. The room had already shifted in his favor. "This meeting is over," he said. Not as a suggestion, not as a reaction, but as a conclusion, and this time, no one argued, no one interrupted, because the weight of what had almost happened settled into the silence, heavy and undeniable. Ethan turned away from the table, not rushed, not triumphant, just resolved, and as he walked toward the exit, past the polished surfaces and the quiet stares of those who sensed something had changed but could not name it, his eyes found Naomi Brooks one last time, moving through the room as if she had always belonged there, as if nothing had shifted at all, and yet, everything had, because the most powerful move of the night had not been made in a boardroom, not written in a contract, but passed quietly, on a small piece of paper, from someone who was never supposed to matter, to someone who finally understood that he should have been paying attention all along. The night did not end when Ethan Caldwell walked out of the restaurant. It followed him, lingering in the quiet hum of the black car waiting at the curb, in the reflection of city lights sliding across the tinted window, in the silence that replaced the constant noise he was used to controlling. He did not check his phone right away, did not call anyone, did not speak, because for the first time in a long time, he was replaying something he did not fully command. The details came back in fragments, the tone of his own voice earlier, the dismissal, the certainty, the assumption that he had already won before the game had even begun, and then the shift, small, precise, irreversible, a single note, a single sentence, and everything changed. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slower than usual, not out of exhaustion, but out of recalibration, because what unsettled him was not just how close he had come to making a costly mistake. It was how easily he had overlooked the person who saw it first. Naomi Brooks, the name settled into his mind now, no longer a passing detail, no longer background noise, but a fixed point in the sequence of events that had just unfolded. Inside the restaurant, the tension he left behind did not dissolve, it tightened, conversations lowered, glances exchanged, and at table 12. Richard Hensley was no longer in control of the narrative he had carefully constructed. The associate shifted again. This time with less certainty, more awareness, as if realizing that whatever had been hidden was no longer protected by ignorance, and across the room, Naomi continued her work, refilling glasses, clearing plates, responding to quiet requests with the same composed precision she had shown all night. But now, the way people looked at her had changed, not openly, not dramatically, but subtly, because something had happened that they could not explain, a shift they could feel but could not trace. And Naomi did not acknowledge it, because she was not there for recognition. She never had been. Her focus remained on the details, the rhythm, the small things that others ignored, because that was where the truth always lived. Back in the car, Ethan finally reached for his phone, not to resume business as usual, but to interrupt it. He opened a secure line, his tone calm but firm as he gave a simple instruction. Pull everything on Hensley and his associates, full audit, immediately. There was no hesitation on the other end. No need for explanation, because the shift in his voice said enough. He ended the call and looked out the window again, the city still moving, still glowing, still unaware of how close one conversation had come to changing everything. And in that quiet moment, a realization settled deeper than the deal, deeper than the money, deeper than the risk, that power was not just about control, not just about being heard, but about knowing when to listen, and more importantly, knowing who to listen to, because the person who had altered the course of his night had done it without raising her voice, without asking for attention, without needing recognition. And that was the part he could not ignore, not anymore, because once you see what you missed, you cannot go back to not seeing it. And Ethan Caldwell understood, as the car pulled into the flow of the city, that this night was not over. Not really. It had only shifted into something else, something quieter, something more deliberate, something that would lead him back to the one person he had underestimated, and this time, he would not make that mistake again. Morning came without ceremony, the kind of grey Manhattan morning where the sky looked undecided and the streets moved anyway, fast, indifferent, and already ahead of anyone trying to catch up. Inside a glass-walled office 40 floors above it all, Ethan Caldwell stood still for once, not pacing, not directing, not controlling, just watching the city stretch beneath him as the report on his desk continued to update in real time. Names, transactions, connections, patterns, everything he had asked for and more, and the deeper it went, the clearer it became that the note had not just saved a deal, it had exposed a structure, something deliberate, something designed to pull him into a position he would not have been able to walk back from easily. He did not react outwardly, he rarely did, but the shift inside him was precise, calculated, permanent, because this was no longer about a single dinner. It was about understanding how close he had come to losing control in a way that money could not immediately fix. He picked up the tablet, scanning the latest update, offshore routing confirmed, third-party intermediaries flagged, communication patterns inconsistent with standard negotiation behavior, and then a pause, a line that mattered more than the rest, initial trigger, unidentified source at point of contact. He stared at that for a second longer, not because he did not know what it meant, but because now he did. Naomi Brooks, a variable no one had accounted for, including him. Across the city, the restaurant had already reset itself, tables cleared, glasses polished, the previous night folded into memory the way places like that always did, efficient, seamless, forgettable, except for the people who could not forget, and Naomi moved through the same routine, clocking in, tying her apron, stepping onto the floor with the same quiet presence she always carried, but inside, she knew something had shifted, not in the room, but in the way one person had looked at her before he left, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if seeing something he had missed. She did not dwell on it, she could not afford to, because people like her did not build their lives on moments, they built them on consistency, on showing up, on staying sharp, on noticing what others ignored. That was what kept her ahead, even when no one realized she was in the race. Back in the office, Ethan set the tablet down, decision forming without hesitation. Set a meeting, he said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a new direction. His assistant paused briefly, with who, and for a fraction of a second, he considered how to answer, because this was not a board member, not an investor, not someone with a title that opened doors automatically. This was someone the system did not even register as relevant, and yet, she had just proven otherwise. Naomi Brooks, he said finally, the name clear, deliberate, and for the first time in a long time, the next move he was making was not about power, not about leverage, not about dominance, it was about understanding. Because the most dangerous mistake he could make now would be to ignore what had already changed him once, and this time, he was paying attention. The request did not reach Naomi Brooks the way most messages did. It did not come with urgency or impatience or the subtle expectation that she should respond immediately. It arrived quietly, through her manager, printed on a small sheet of paper and handed to her between orders, as if it were just another shift update, but the name on it did not belong to that world, Ethan Caldwell. She read it once, then again. Not because she did not understand it, but because she did, an understanding carried weight. Her manager watched her carefully, trying to read her reaction, but Naomi did not give one. She folded the paper once, precise, and slipped it into her apron pocket as if it were nothing more than a receipt. He said it is important, the manager added, lowering his voice slightly, as if the importance might change her answer. Naomi nodded, a simple acknowledgement. When she asked, her tone steady, controlled. And when the time was given, she did not negotiate, did not delay. She just said yes, because she knew this was not about convenience, it was about consequence. Across the city, Ethan stood by the same window, the skyline no longer just a view but a map of decisions, and this one felt different, not because it carried more risk, but because it carried more truth. He had spent years building a system where information flowed toward him, filtered, refined, controlled, but this had come from outside that system, from someone who had no obligation to protect him, no incentive to intervene, and yet she had, and that made her different. Not just useful, but necessary to understand. The time of the meeting approached without ceremony, no press, no announcement, just a quiet adjustment in two separate routines that were about to intersect again. Naomi arrived exactly when she said she would, not early, not late, just on time, dressed simply. The same understated precision she carried in the restaurant now translated into a different environment, glass walls, polished floors, a space designed to reflect power without needing to state it. She did not look around in awe, did not slow her pace. She walked in as she always did, aware, observant, present, and when she stepped into the office, Ethan was already there, not seated behind his desk, not elevated above the moment, but standing, facing her directly, the distance between them measured not in feet, but in everything that had changed since the night before. There was no immediate greeting, no forced formality, just a brief silence that allowed the moment to settle into something real. You came, he said finally, his voice even. Not surprised, but acknowledging the choice. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. You asked, she replied, and there was something in that exchange, simple, direct, that stripped away the usual layers of power and expectation, because neither of them was pretending anymore. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from him, but he did not sit first. He waited, and when she took her seat, he followed, equal distance, equal level, a small shift, but a deliberate one, because this conversation was not going to follow the rules he was used to, and for the first time, that was exactly what he intended. The silence between them was not empty, it was deliberate, filled with unspoken calculations on both sides, and Ethan Caldwell let it remain for a moment longer than most people would have been comfortable with, because he wanted to see if she would rush to fill it, if she would adjust, explain, justify. But Naomi Brooks did none of those things. She simply sat there, composed, present, waiting without impatience, and that told him more than any words could have. You changed the outcome of that meeting, he said finally, his voice calm, not accusatory, not overly grateful, just precise. Naomi did not react to the statement itself, only to the weight behind it. No, she replied, just as steady, you did. And again, she redirected it, not dismissing her role, but refusing to take ownership of something that had required his decision to matter. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her, because this was not how most people responded in a room like this. Most would lean into the moment, try to secure something, recognition, opportunity, advantage, but she did not. She remained anchored, as if the value of what she had done did not need to be negotiated. Most people would have said thank you, he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation. Naomi met his gaze, unshaken. Most people would have ignored it, she replied, and there it was again, that clarity, that quiet confidence rooted not in ego, but in experience. Ethan allowed a small pause, letting the words settle, because they carried truth he could not argue with. Why did you not? He asked, and this time the question mattered more, because it was not about the event, it was about her choice within it. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she needed time, but because she chose her words carefully, the same way she had chosen to act the night before. Because I have seen what happens when people assume they are safe, she said, her tone even, but grounded in something deeper, and I have learned not to trust that. Ethan absorbed that, recognizing the pattern, the mindset that had allowed her to notice what others missed. It was not luck, it was discipline, built over time in situations where missing details had consequences. You do not work like a server, he said, more directly now, and Naomi did not take offense, did not correct him. I work exactly like one, she replied, I just pay attention differently, and that difference, he realized, was everything, because it meant her position had never limited her awareness, only the way others perceived it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, the conversation shifting from reflection to intention. What you did last night, he said, most people in your position would not have risked getting involved. Naomi held his gaze, steady, unwavering. Most people in my position do not get a second chance if they ignore something important, she answered, and there was no dramatics in it, no attempt to impress, just a fact shaped by experience. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more now than he had when he first asked to meet her, because this was not about a single moment of courage, it was about a pattern of awareness, a way of moving through the world that made her see what others overlooked, and that was not something he could afford to ignore again, not after everything he had built, not after how close he had come to losing control. And as the conversation settled into a new phase, one no longer defined by the past night but by what could come next, Ethan Caldwell realized that this meeting was not about gratitude, it was about alignment, because the most valuable thing in the room was no longer his power, but her perspective, and this time, he was listening. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it was defined, structured, and moving toward something neither of them had planned before that moment, and Ethan Caldwell did not rush it, because rushing would have meant forcing the outcome, and this was not a situation he wanted to control in the usual way. This required precision, awareness, and something he was not used to relying on, trust. He rested his hands lightly on the desk, not as a display of authority, but as a pause, a moment to let the weight of the conversation settle into something real. You see things before they happen, he said, not as a compliment, not as an exaggeration, but as a measured conclusion drawn from everything he had observed. Naomi Brooks did not smile, did not deflect, she simply considered the statement for a brief second before responding. I see patterns, she said, her voice calm, steady, and patterns do not lie unless people do. Ethan absorbed that, because it aligned with everything he had built his success on: data, timing, signals. But what set her apart was where she found those signals, not in reports, not in analytics, but in moments most people dismissed as irrelevant, and that made her dangerous in a way he understood immediately, not dangerous to him, but to anyone who underestimated her. Then let me be direct, he said, leaning forward slightly, the conversation narrowing into focus. I want you to work with me. The words landed without hesitation, without decoration, clear and intentional, and for the first time since she entered the room, Naomi's gaze shifted, not away, but deeper, as if measuring the weight behind what he had just said. She did not react quickly, did not accept, did not refuse. She let the silence return, not as resistance, but as evaluation, because she understood something he did not need to say. This was not an offer made lightly, and it was not one she would accept lightly either. Doing what? She asked finally, her tone unchanged, not impressed, not intimidated, just precise. Ethan did not hesitate, because he had already considered it before she walked into the room. Helping me see what I miss, he replied, and there was no arrogance left in that sentence, only clarity, because he knew now that what he had missed could have cost him more than money. Naomi held his gaze, steady, unwavering, and in that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their first interaction no longer existed. This was no longer a CEO speaking to a waitress, this was one strategist recognizing another, just shaped by different environments, different experiences. You already have people for that, she said, not as an objection, but as a fact. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it. I have people who report what they are trained to see, he answered. I do not have someone who notices what they are not trained to look for. The distinction was clear, deliberate, and it mattered, because it defined exactly why she was here, why this conversation was happening at all. Naomi considered that, not emotionally, not reactively, but logically, weighing not just the opportunity, but the implications, because stepping into his world would change the way she moved through her own, and she understood that better than anyone. And if I say no, she asked, not testing him, but clarifying the boundaries. Ethan did not hesitate. "Then you walk out of here the same way you walked in," he said, "with your choices untouched," and that was the moment everything settled, not because of the offer, but because of the way it was given, without pressure, without expectation, without the assumption that he could buy her decision, and Naomi recognized that immediately, because it meant this was not about control, it was about respect, and respect was something she did not negotiate. She either saw it or she did not, and now, for the first time since the night before, she allowed herself a small shift, not in posture, not in tone, but in decision, because this was no longer about what had happened, it was about what could happen next, and whether or not she chose to be part of it. Naomi Brooks did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that some decisions deserved space before they were spoken out loud. The room remained still around them, the skyline stretching silently behind Ethan Caldwell as if waiting for her response, and she let the quiet settle, not as hesitation, but as clarity forming in real time, because she knew exactly what this moment meant. Not just the opportunity, but the shift it represented, stepping from a world where she observed unnoticed into one where being seen would change the rules entirely, and she did not take that lightly. "You are not asking me to work for you," she said finally, her voice calm, measured. "You are asking me to step into your system." Ethan did not interrupt, did not correct, because she was right, and more importantly, she understood what that meant, and systems, she continued, change people if they are not careful. The words were not defensive, not resistant, just grounded in experience. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that, because he had seen it happen, had built systems that demanded adaptation, sometimes at the cost of perspective, and that was exactly why this conversation mattered. "Only if they forget why they stepped into them," he replied, his tone steady, not persuasive, not forceful, just clear. Naomi held his gaze, considering that, weighing not just his words, but the way he said them, because intent was always louder than language if you knew how to listen, and she did. "I do not need a title," she said, shifting the frame, "and I am not interested in being part of something that only values me when it is convenient." There was no challenge in her voice, just a boundary, clearly defined. Ethan did not hesitate, because he had already moved past the kind of thinking that would reduce her to a role. "Then do not take a title," he answered, "and do not be convenient," and there was something in that response, something precise and unfiltered, that matched her tone exactly, because it did not try to shape her into his structure, it made space for her within it, and that was different. Naomi recognized it immediately, because she had spent enough time navigating spaces where she was expected to adjust, to soften, to fit, and this was not that. This was an offer that required her to remain exactly who she was. "You are asking me to stay the same in a place that is designed to change people," she said, not questioning, but confirming. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his focus sharp, intentional. "I am asking you to make sure it does not," he replied, and for the first time since the conversation began, the balance between them settled into something equal, not in status, not in experience, but in clarity, because they both understood what was being proposed. This was not a job, not a position, not a simple exchange of time for money. This was a shift in perspective, a deliberate choice to bring a different kind of awareness into a space that rarely allowed it. Naomi let that settle, not rushing to respond, because the weight of it mattered more than the speed, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not change, but the decision within it did. "Then I will do it my way," she said, not as a condition, but as a fact, and Ethan did not smile, did not react with surprise. He simply nodded, once, because that was the only answer he would have accepted. Not compliance, not adaptation, but presence, real and unchanged, and in that moment, the agreement was not signed, not formalized, not written down, but it existed, clear and understood, because sometimes the most important decisions were not made in contracts, they were made in conversations where both sides chose to see each other clearly, and neither side looked away. The agreement did not change the room, but it changed everything inside it, not in a way that could be measured on a spreadsheet or announced in a press release, but in the quiet recalibration of two people who now understood exactly what the other brought to the table. Naomi Brooks stood as the conversation reached its natural end, not because she was dismissed, but because she chose the moment, and that choice alone marked the difference between who she had been seen as and who she had proven herself to be. Ethan Caldwell did not stop her, did not extend the moment unnecessarily, because he recognized something he had not valued before: timing. Not just in deals, but in people. "We will start soon," he said, his tone steady, not commanding, not tentative, just certain. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the path ahead without needing to define it further, because clarity did not always require details. Sometimes it required trust in the structure that had just been set. She turned and walked toward the door, her steps the same as they had always been, measured, controlled, unaffected by the scale of the room she was leaving, because for her, the environment had never dictated her awareness. Only her role within it, and now, that role had expanded, not by title, not by permission, but by recognition. As the door closed softly behind her, the office returned to silence, but it was not the same silence as before. It was sharper, more focused, as if the space itself had adjusted to accommodate something new. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, not moving, not reaching for his phone, just standing there, replaying the sequence that had brought him to this point, the dinner. The note, the shift, the conversation, each step precise, each decision layered, and at the center of it all, a realization that settled deeper than any deal he had ever closed. That power was not defined by how much control you held, but by how well you understood what you did not see. Across the city, Naomi stepped back into the rhythm of her day, the noise of the street, the movement of people, the constant flow of a world that did not pause for anyone. And yet, something had changed, not in how she walked, not in how she spoke, but in what lay ahead, because the path she had chosen was no longer confined to the spaces where she had learned to observe. It now extended into places where her perspective would not just protect her, but shape outcomes far beyond her immediate reach. She did not rush, did not look back, because she did not need to. The decision had been made, and she trusted it, just as she trusted the instincts that had led her to act in the first place. And somewhere between the quiet discipline she carried and the power Ethan had built, a new balance had formed, one that neither of them fully controlled, but both understood, and that was what made it real. Because in a world where people often measured worth by visibility, status, or noise, this moment proved something different, something quieter, something harder to ignore. That the person who changes everything is not always the one at the center of the room. Sometimes, it is the one who sees what others miss, acts when others hesitate, and walks away without needing to be seen, because the impact speaks louder than recognition ever could. And that night, the man who thought he owned the room learned that the most valuable voice was the one he almost ignored.